welcome to The Explainer. We're diving into something truly wild today. The United States is currently the richest and most powerful country in history, but here's the secret. Its rise to superpower status was absolutely not planned. Seriously, if you look at the raw data and the historical records, it wasn't some grand design. It was actually a 400-year chronological chain of highly unexpected historical accidents, staggering luck, and incredibly bizarre timing. So, to make sense of this massive geopolitical shift, here's our roadmap. We're going to speed through 6 key eras: discovery and early colonies, the 7 Years' War, taxation without representation, the Revolutionary War, manifest destiny and expansion, and finally the rise of a world power. We'll trace the whole shebang from the very first European footprints through the bloody breakups and massive real estate deals all the way to the dawn of the 20th century.
Okay, let's jump right into Era 1, Discovery and Early Colonies. Stumbling upon a continent.
The whole domino effect actually kicks off in 1453. Constantinople falls to the Turks, which completely shuts down Europe's usual trade routes to the east. Desperate for a new way to get Indian spices, Christopher Columbus sails west in 1492. Now, he obviously didn't find spices, but he bumped right into the Caribbean. 7 years later, Amerigo Vespucci shows up and realizes, hey, this isn't Asia at all, it's a totally new continent. And while Spain and Portugal immediately started scooping up the gold-rich southern areas, the English? They basically ignored North America. It literally took them over a century to finally plant successful roots in 1607 with Jamestown.
As more settlers arrived, geography literally dictated destiny. 2 completely distinct regional economies evolved, and it was entirely based on the climate. The northern colonies had this rocky, icy terrain, right? So they were driven by fishing, timber, and eventually early industrialization. Meanwhile, the southern colonies had this warm, fertile climate that was just perfectly suited for massive plantation farming. We're talking tobacco, cotton, and sugarcane. This basic geographic division completely set up the agricultural and industrial motivations for the entire future nation. Moving right along to Era 2, the 7 Years' War, the cost of empire. Fast forward to the mid-18th century, and a massive global conflict changes the trajectory of the world forever. From 1756 to 1763, the British and their American colonists teamed up to fight the French and Native American tribes for control of the continent. And they won. France had to hand over massive territories, including Canada. But here is the major catch. Winning a global war is astronomically expensive. Britain was left with a crippling war debt, and honestly, that financial crisis in London is exactly what would fundamentally shatter their relationship with the colonies. Which brings us perfectly to Era 3, taxation without representation, also known as the Bad Breakup. You have to keep in mind, these colonists probably considered themselves British for 6 generations. That is, until a sudden wave of post-war taxes completely alienated them. The rebellion boiled over so fast. Parliament passes the Sugar Act in 1764, then the Stamp Act in 65, literally taxing everyday items like paper and legal documents. The colonists boycotted, so Britain sent in troops. And this aggressive escalation led straight to deadly street violence, with the Boston Massacre in 1770, culminating in the famous Boston Tea Party of 1773. In less than a decade, they went from totally loyal subjects to open rebels. And it all really boiled down to this one resounding battle cry. The colonists were absolutely furious, but it wasn't just about the money. It was the principle of the thing. They were being dictated to by an overseas parliament thousands of miles away where they had absolutely zero voice. They just wanted the right to self-govern their own domestic affairs. The absolute breaking point was this incredible mini heist orchestrated by the Sons of Liberty. Protesting a British tea monopoly that was going to undercut local merchants, they disguised themselves as dock workers, sneaked onto East India Company's ships in the dead of night, and chucked 340 chests of tea straight into Boston Harbor. Just a massive, blatant destruction of British property. And that sparks Era 4, the Revolutionary War, the global fight for independence. Britain's heavy-handed punishments for that tea party pushed the colonies right over the edge into an all-out war. In 1776, they officially declared independence. But here's what's fascinating. This local rebellion actually became a global chessboard. France and Spain jumped into the war on the side of the Americans. Why? Well, they saw a perfect opportunity to get revenge on Britain for the 7 Years' War. By the time of the 1783 Treaty of Paris, the U.S. won its independence, while France and Spain successfully carved back territories of their own. All right, on to Era 5, manifest destiny and expansion. Buying a continent. So winning independence was really only step one. The newly united country had a very messy initial government that was failing fast, at least until they drafted a new constitution that actually worked. But once that federal government was stabilized, the U.S. began expanding its borders at just breakneck speed. Check out this number: $15 million. In 1803, the United States made perhaps the greatest real estate deal in history, the Louisiana Purchase. For just $15 million, America bought a massive stretch of territory from France, instantly doubling the size of the entire country overnight. And the reason they got it so incredibly cheap is deeply ironic. Napoleon Bonaparte, yes, the ruler of France, originally wanted an American empire, but he was gearing up to invade Britain, and he desperately needed cash. He famously declared that selling Louisiana would fund his European war against Britain, and it would ensure the Americans remained friendly to France. He literally sold out his American empire just to bankroll his European ambitions. Then, decades later, right after a bloody civil war that abolished slavery and reunited the nation, the U.S. made another absurdly cheap land grab. $7 million. That is all it cost in 1867 to purchase the massive, resource-rich territory of Alaska directly from the Russian Tsar. Unbelievable. Which brings us to our final stop, Era 6, Rise of a World Power. Islands, canals, and global reach. So through purchases, treaties, and a war with Mexico, America had stretched from sea to shining sea in just half a century. With the continent secured, they started looking beyond their borders. And this rapid overseas expansion was a real mix of the bizarre and the aggressive. First, you had the Guano Islands Act, literally a law allowing Americans to claim random uninhabited islands just because they were covered in bird poop, which, believe it or not, was a highly valuable fertilizer back then. Then, American businessmen orchestrated the annexation of Hawaii to secure crucial naval bases. Finally, in 1898, the U.S. won the Spanish-American War, swiftly capturing Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, effectively swallowing up the very last remnants of the empire Christopher Columbus had started 400 years prior. The crowning achievement of all this new global reach came in 1914. President Theodore Roosevelt outmaneuvered Colombia by backing a newly independent Panama, which allowed the U.S. to build and open the Panama Canal. This was a monumental engineering marvel. It allowed America's powerful, modern Navy to seamlessly patrol both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, completely cementing their global dominance, just as World War I was kicking off over in Europe. It's a dizzying journey, isn't it? Which leaves us with this final massive question to ponder. From a lost explorer who thought he was in India searching for spices to a 20th century global superpower, was America's rise to the top a product of brilliant calculated strategy, or was it just 400 years of chaotic,